They didn't break her with bullets or battles. They tried to break her with silence, with humiliation, with a funeral that was never meant to be sacred. What was supposed to be a moment of national mourning became a stage, a brutal performance, of power meant to strip one woman of her dignity in front of the whole world. But they underestimated her, because when they dragged General Raven Whitmore through the dirt beside her son's coffin, they didn't end her story. They started a war. The morning light hung over Jefferson Memorial Cemetery like a curtain of grief. The sky was veiled in soft gray clouds, as if nature itself had dimmed for what was to come. Rows of uniformed officers lined the edges of the field. Their presence meant to symbolize respect, but their silence would soon say otherwise. At the center of it all stood General Raven Whitmore, the highest-ranking black woman in U.S. military history, now a grieving mother in full ceremonial dress. Her son, Captain Xavier Monroe, had been returned home in a flag-draped coffin. He had died serving a country that would soon show just how little it valued his sacrifice. She stood like a monument, immovable, unreadable. Her uniform gleamed with precision. Every ribbon, every polished button told the story of a life lived in discipline and honor. But behind her eyes was a storm that no rank could contain. As the honor guard gently passed her the folded flag, Xavier's last emblem of service, her trembling hands reached out. Her fingers brushed the stars and stripes, clinging to the last tangible thread of her son. Then it happened. A rustle in the crowd. Sharp movement. A figure burst forward. Tanner Grayson. A white teenager, courtroom badge still clipped to his blazer, face twisted with something feral. "She's a threat," he shouted, shoving mourners aside. The words hit like a slap across the field, but what came next sent ice through every vein. In one fluid motion, he pulled a pistol and drove it directly into Raven's temple. Gasps erupted, like wildfire. Cameras snapped into a frenzy, but the uniformed officers lining the cemetery, they didn't move. 20 armed men under the command of Chief Malcolm Foster watched the gun touch the head of a black general and did nothing. Not a shout, not a step forward. Their silence wasn't fear, it was permission. Raven stood still, unflinching. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had long since become part of her marrow. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to remind her she didn't belong in her uniform, but it was the first time it happened on the day she buried her child. Tanner's voice cracked with venom. Time to remind her who runs this country. The gun trembled in his hand. The flag Xavier died for fluttered between them like a fragile truce. Raven didn't go for a weapon. She reached for the flag. Her voice cut the air like fractured steel. "Not today." Then a gunshot split the silence. Screams erupted. Chaos swallowed the cemetery. But it wasn't Tanner who had fired. It was Officer Wilson, one of Foster's, and who had discharged his weapon into the sky. A tactic, a diversion. Then his voice boomed through the chaos. "She's got a gun." Even as Raven stood frozen, clearly unarmed, the lie ignited a trap that had been laid long before the ceremony ever began. 2 more officers lunged forward. Reeves tackled Raven to the dirt, grinding her face beside her son's coffin. Her medals hit the marble with a metallic clatter. The folded flag fell from her hands and was trampled beneath police boots. Cameras captured everything. Live streams lit up with panic. Phones zoomed in on the woman in dress blues being shoved into handcuffs while the boy who held the gun was gently escorted away. "General Raven Whitmore," Officer Reeves sneered. "You're under arrest for threatening an officer and inciting violence." She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She let them drag her away, the dirt of her son's final resting place smearing across the uniform she had earned through decades of service. The funeral was no longer a funeral. It was a public execution, not of life but of legacy. A mother came to honor her son. She left in chains. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Because no matter how many stars adorned her shoulders, no matter how many wars she had fought, to the system that had sent those officers, she was black before she was anything else. And in that moment, they wanted her reminded. reduced, erased. But as the cruiser door slammed behind her and the sounds of the cemetery faded, Raven's tears didn't fall. Her mind didn't spiral. Her soul didn't shatter. It sharpened. They had made a fatal error. They hadn't just taken her dignity. They had taken the wrong mother. Because this wasn't just injustice anymore. This was war, and she had nothing left to lose. 3 days before the nation watched her dragged through cemetery soil, General Raven Whitmore stood at 30,000 feet above Houston, staring out a narrow oval window, watching clouds swirl beneath the wing of her military transport. Below, the city lay still, unaware that its silence was about to be broken. Inside her chest, behind rows of medals and ceremonial ribbons, a war was already beginning. She hadn't slept on the flight. Grief had a way of keeping the eyelids open. Military discipline kept her spine straight, but the ache, the mother's ache that lived in her ribs now, that was new. Her son, Captain Xavier Monroe, had come home in a flag-draped box, an American hero, dead not from enemy fire but something worse. Silence, neglect, or maybe something more deliberate. As the wheels struck the tarmac with a jolt, Raven whispered a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She adjusted her cap, smoothed the front of her jacket, and prepared to step into a city that had once been her childhood refuge. Now it would be her battlefield. The airport was unusually crowded for a weekday. People turned as she walked through the terminal, some saluting, some snapping photos quietly, others just staring. A little black girl near gate C-13 tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, eyes wide. "Is she a superhero?" Her mother nodded, eyes soft. Raven almost smiled. Almost. Then the spell broke. Random screening, barked a EO, voice behind a security checkpoint. Raven paused, confused. "Excuse me?" The man who approached her was Officer Greg Matz, a thick-necked white security officer with the kind of smile that didn't reach his pale blue eyes. His badge shone like it had been overpolished just to intimidate. "Step aside, ma'am, remove your jacket." "I've already cleared federal security. I'm on military emergency travel. I'm General Raven Whitmore," she replied, handing over her credentials, her orders, and her identification. Matz didn't even glance at them. "This says you're a lieutenant general, that right?" he asked, his voice slick with condescension. "Looks fake. You saying you earned all this?" Nearby travelers froze. Phones hovered. No one spoke, but they all watched. Raven steadied her breath, shoulders squared. "Officer, I am here to bury my son, Captain Xavier Monroe, killed in service. Please don't make this harder." He didn't flinch. "You want hard? Try doing my job, jack it off now." The next 2 hours unraveled like a bad memory she couldn't wake from. She was stripped down to socks, her ribbons questioned, her rank disputed. One agent asked her to spell Pentagon 3 times. Another scanned each medal like it might detonate. To the people watching, Raven wasn't a general. She was a suspect, not Raven the war strategist. Not Raven the veteran, just another black woman who looked too proud in uniform. When her daughter Amara, a sharp, fire-eyed civil rights attorney, finally arrived at the checkpoint, her fury came in like a thunderclap. "Is this a joke? You're harassing a 3-star general because she's black?" Officer Matz raised an eyebrow, unbothered. "Back up, or you'll be detained." Raven touched Amara's wrist. "Let it go. Not now. We're here for Xavier." They walked out in silence, but as they exited into the humid Houston air, Raven didn't miss it. Officer Matz watched her leave, then slowly, deliberately, pulled out his phone. "Target confirmed," he whispered into the receiver. "The general is here." The voice on the other end was calm, cold. "Good. The Brotherhood appreciates your loyalty." The Monroe family home in Houston's 3rd Ward smelled like history. Photographs lined the walls, Calvin Monroe in a crisp naval uniform, Raven as a girl in JROTC gear, Xavier in every graduation cap he ever earned. The house was filled with folded flags and silent pride. But that night, It was filled with something else, suspicion. In the quiet of her childhood room, Raven sat on the edge of her old bed, her body still wrapped in her ceremonial jacket. Her father, Calvin, stood in the doorway, a weathered man with eyes that had seen too much war and not enough peace. "This came 2 days before the notice," he said quietly, holding out a sealed envelope. "From Xavier." Raven's hands shook as she opened it. Inside, a single sentence in her son's hurried handwriting. "If anything happens to me, give this to Mom. Trust no one in uniform but her." Behind the note was a thumb drive. She swallowed hard, slid it into her laptop. The screen flickered, then the truth exploded. Dozens of folders, labeled files, surveillance footage, courtroom transcripts, internal memos, Operation Judge's Gate. Black. Veterans targeted Houston PD, coordinated interference, and then images. Chief Malcolm Foster standing beside a young white teen in a courtroom, Tanner Grayson, the boy who would one day shove a gun into Raven's skull during her son's funeral. Her breathing turned shallow. Xavier had been investigating a covert network within the justice system, a fraternity of judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, and defense lawyers, a racial cartel calling themselves the Brotherhood. Their goal? Prevent the rise of black leadership in American power structures. Their method? Sabotage, arrests, deployment manipulation. They didn't just let racism happen, they organized it, weaponized it. She opened a folder titled Deployment Interference. Her son had hacked into Pentagon communications. She clicked one file, a message exchange between Judge Howard Whitaker, Chief Foster, and a Pentagon liaison. They had deliberately reassigned Xavier's unit to a hostile zone in Afghanistan. Not strategy, not chance. Execution, signed, sealed, disguised. He hadn't died in war. He had been assassinated by policy. Her hands clenched around the laptop. Her jaw tightened. Her son didn't just stumble into danger. He walked into a trap. He tried to expose it. They silenced him. But he'd left behind a blueprint, and she was done being a soldier. Now she would be something else, a reckoning. A knock echoed through the Monroe home. Raven tensed. It was Amara, her face tense, her eyes burning, and someone else. Officer James Chen, one of Xavier's few trusted friends. He stumbled into the room, limping, one eye swollen, his badge gone. "They got to me," he rasped. Raven stood, catching him before he collapsed. "But I still have something left," Chen whispered, pulling a battered flash drive from inside his jacket. "This is everything. Names, badge numbers, recordings, surveillance. It goes all the way to the top." He looked at her, blood crusted along his brow. "Judge Whitaker. He's the keystone. You take him out, the whole network collapses." Raven didn't blink. She took the drive, closed her hand around it like a weapon. No uniform had protected her son. No metal had shielded his life, but his evidence? This was war material, and she was no longer here to mourn. She was here to dismantle. The Brotherhood had taken everything, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought Xavier was alone. They forgot about his mother. The morning broke blood orange over Jefferson Memorial Cemetery, casting long, solemn shadows across marble tombstones and the manicured grass where generations of sacrifice had been laid to rest. But today, the air didn't hum with reverence. It carried the weight of something more calculated, something colder. Not mourning, not grief. Anticipation. In a quiet hotel room miles away, General Raven Whitmore stood alone before a mirror, buttoning her ceremonial dress uniform with unflinching precision. Each ribbon, each polished metal gleamed beneath the early light pouring through the curtains. Her cap rested on the edge of the dresser, untouched until the last second, like a crown not yet earned for the day's battle. This wasn't just a funeral. It was a trap. The cemetery had been crawling with Houston PD since before dawn, officers, personally handpicked by Chief Malcolm Foster. Raven knew their faces, not from departmental websites or public reports, but from Xavier's files. These were the same men tied to forged testimonies, suppressed surveillance footage, and blacklisted veterans. The same men who had joked over text about rebalancing the racial dynamic in the ranks. Now they stood as silent sentries pretending to protect but positioned like predators. Raven adjusted her gloves, staring into her reflection. She didn't blink, didn't speak. Her daughter Amara stepped into the room dressed in black with a jawline of fire. She didn't need to speak either. Her eyes said everything. "They're watching," she finally whispered. Raven nodded. "Let them." The SUV ride to the cemetery was silent. No music. No prayer. Just the steady pulse of grief wrapped in preparation. Raven's breathing was measured, her hands still. She had led troops into combat zones with less intensity. But nothing in her military training could prepare her for this. The ritual burial of her only child, layered over a coordinated act of public humiliation. As the vehicle approached the gates, a line of white officers checked IDs at the entrance. Black veterans were slowed, some pulled aside. The rest, ushered through like unwanted guests. Sergeant Cole, one of Xavier's brothers-in-arms and part of the honor guard, was held at the gate for 45 minutes over paperwork discrepancies. By the time he was let through, the formation had already begun. Inside, the optics had been arranged like a stage set, cameras, tripods, media vans. And at the center of it all stood Tanner Grayson, in a crisp ceremonial blazer, chest out, chin high, courtroom tag still faintly visible near his lapel. A youth reform representative, a symbol of redemption, a lie. He wasn't just attending Xavier's funeral. He had been assigned to it, handpicked, like the officers, by Foster himself, framed not as a threat but a rehabilitated teen doing community service. Raven's eyes locked on him as she stepped from the vehicle. Her heels struck the earth with a sound only she could hear, like footsteps onto a battlefield. Her face betrayed nothing, but inside her chest something cracked, sharp and permanent. This wasn't a coincidence, it was theater. A final act meant to fracture her in full view. Amara appeared at her side, her voice barely above breath. "He's not here to honor Xavier. He's here to break you." Raven didn't answer. She walked forward with the steadiness of a warship. The folded flag sat waiting on a black-draped podium. Beyond it, Xavier's coffin. Beyond that, hundreds gathered. Family, soldiers, strangers. Phones already lifted. Live streams already ticking upward in viewers. This would not be a private moment of grief. This was national theater. The chaplain stumbled through the opening prayer. His voice cracked not from emotion but from unease. Even he sensed it. The wrongness, the choreography, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, it was Raven's turn. She stepped to the microphone, with the same energy she had once used to brief troops before combat. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium, not for balance but for control. "My son, Captain Xavier Monroe, wore this nation's uniform with pride," she began, voice calm but edged with steel. "He believed in a country that didn't always believe in him." Murmurs flickered through the crowd. "He didn't just fight for America abroad. He fought for its soul here at home. And in the end, he uncovered something. A network. A brotherhood. Not of honor, but of silence. Men who wear robes and badges, who rewrite justice in the shadows." Now the murmurs grew louder. She glanced, to the rear of the crowd. Chief Foster stood, arms crossed, face locked. Officers began to shift subtly toward the podium, but Raven pressed on. They didn't just fear Xavier. They feared what he found. And when they realized they couldn't intimidate him, they deployed him into the teeth of danger, not by accident, by design. Gasps now. She reached into her jacket, lifted a worn envelope. This was his final message. "If something happens to me, give this to Mom. Trust no one in uniform but her." She held it high, her voice unflinching. "I intend to finish what he started." Then the trap was sprung. Tanner Grayson stepped forward from the OU honor guard line, not rushed, not panicked, calm, calculated, mechanical. "General Whitmore," he called out. Raven paused. Cameras turned. He kept walking. One hand reached beneath his blazer. Amara shouted, "He's got something." But it was too late. A gunshot cracked the sky, but it didn't come from Tanner. It came from Officer Wilson, firing deliberately upward, protocol triggered. "She's armed," he screamed, pointing directly at Raven. Chaos detonated. Officer Reeves lunged from the side, slamming Raven to the ground. Her metals clanged against stone. Her hat flew. The flag, Xavier's flag, tumbled from her grip and into the dirt. Phones captured every frame. The nation watched in real time as the highest-ranking black woman in U.S. military history was tackled beside her son's coffin, accused of pulling a weapon she never touched. Tanner? He stood untouched. Officers surrounded him, not to subdue but to shield. Amara screamed. "She's unarmed," a bystander cried out. "I got it all on video. She didn't do anything." But none of it mattered. Reeves pulled Raven to her knees, cuffs tight around her wrists. "Resisting arrest," he snarled. Xavier's coffin loomed just feet away. His flag was now stained with dirt and boot prints. From the shadows, soldiers from Xavier's unit began to move, one by one, stepping forward, hands raised, eyes blazing. But the circle of officers snapped into formation, weapons drawn. "Anybody moves, they go down," one barked. Raven, still kneeling, lifted her head. Her lip bled, her uniform torn, her star insignia glinted beneath the stain of accusation. Phone camera panned close to her face and she whispered, not to the officers, not to the crowd, but to the coffin. "I see you, Xavier. I see what they feared." Because this wasn't just a funeral. It was a message. It was a performance of power, a public silencing. And Raven, dirtied, handcuffed, defiant, was now its unwilling symbol. They had choreographed everything down to the second: the shooter, the shot in the sky, the false accusation, the staged rescue of Tanner. It was more than injustice. It was a scripted erasure. But what they hadn't counted on, what they never do, was that Raven Whitmore would not play the role they wrote for her. Not today. Not ever. The cold steel door clanged shut behind her, the echo chasing itself down the dim hallway like a threat. Raven Whitmore, once a name that commanded reverence in the Pentagon, now sat in a holding cell reeking of bleach, sweat, and the forgotten stench of lives warehoused and dismissed. She had arrived at Harris County Jail in full dress uniform, but the fabric was torn now, stained with cemetery soil and blood from the gash on her temple. Her medals had been stripped off during processing, her rank ignored, her legacy reduced to a booking number. And the system? It wasn't done yet. 4 hours passed with no phone call, no lawyer, no water. Every officer who walked by offered the same thing: silence or a sneer. One deputy, smug and pale, leaned in during fingerprinting and whispered, "Out of uniform, you're just another angry black woman with delusions of grandeur." They smudged her prints repeatedly, forcing her through the scanner over and over. "Oops, guess your hands ain't used to real work," he chuckled. No one stopped him. No one even looked up. But Raven did not break, because in that quiet, in that rot, she had seen worse. She had crawled through blood in Kandahar, stared down barrel fire in Ramadi. She had buried friends. Now she had buried her son. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be the thing that ended her. When Officer Lucinda Jackson, a black woman with sharp eyes and a clipped voice, finally entered her block, Raven could tell something was wrong. Jackson didn't address her rank, didn't call her ma'am. She just leaned in close and whispered. Judge Whitaker escalated the charge. Attempted murder. Raven blinked, not in surprise, but in calculation. "They're moving fast," Jackson added, "trying to bury you before you speak." Moments later, she was transferred into general population. The guards made a show of it. Every camera along the hallway caught the handcuffed walk. The whisper trail had already begun before she even entered the cell block. That's her, the general. The one from the funeral, And yet, when the gate clanged open, the silence inside wasn't hostile, it was reverent. She stepped into a sea of orange jumpsuits, eyes trained on her like searchlights. A towering woman with braids down her back and arms like iron stepped forward. Her voice was low but carried like gospel. "General Whitmore, my brother served under you, 3rd Infantry, said you never lost a man under your watch. Said you brought 'em all home." Raven looked her in the eye. "We tried." The woman, Teresa, nodded once. "You got protection in here. Anyone touches you, they answer to all of us." And just like that, the uniform they tried to disgrace became her shield once again. But this time, not among generals. Among the forgotten. Former soldiers, mothers, daughters, women who had seen the same system that now tried to erase Raven, rip their lives apart. They brought her food, an extra blanket, clean socks. One whispered, "Guard schedule." Another passed a folded newspaper beneath her pillow. Headlines already swirled. "General arrested at funeral sparks national outrage." Still, the system pushed harder. That night, guards tore through her cell. "Inspection," they barked, flipping her cot, shredding the few things she had. Sleep deprivation became the next tactic. Lights never dimmed. Doors slammed without reason. A whisper came from one guard. "The gatekeepers send their regards." But the cracks in the machine had already begun to show, because far beyond the walls of Harris County Jail, people were moving. Amara, Officer Chen, and now Agent Dominic Carter from the DOJ. The three of them had become a triangle of fire. One file turned into dozens. Xavier's drive was only the beginning. The second flash drive, hand-delivered by a bloodied Chen, contained names, coordinates, hidden surveillance footage. The files told a story, a brotherhood, a conspiracy, a network that spanned from courtrooms to Pentagon back channels. Carter knew what they were looking at wasn't just corruption, it was domestic terrorism, and in every hidden email, every flagged deployment, every redacted arrest record, they saw fingerprints that pointed upward, Judge Whitaker, Chief Malcolm Foster, and behind them both a name whispered like a ghost, Senator Howard Whitaker. Amara called in veterans groups. Carter filed emergency subpoenas. Officer Chen, bruised but relentless, met with former colleagues who'd stayed silent for years. Whistleblowers began to surface. Patterns were emerging. Black veterans sent into fatal deployments. White offenders handed leniency under sealed dockets. But the next opportunity for truth wouldn't be on a press release, it would be in court. Tanner Grayson's trial, State of Texas vs. Tanner Grayson. On paper, it was a routine sentencing, a juvenile hate crime enhanced by assault. In reality, it was the theater in which the entire system was about to face its reckoning. The courtroom buzzed with tension as reporters packed every seat, their cameras set like traps. Foster's officers filled the gallery. Court clerks exchanged glances. Tanner sat beside his attorney, looking freshly groomed and deeply rehearsed, his hands folded. His expression a mix of feigned remorse and inherited arrogance. Judge Howard Whitaker stepped onto the bench like a man walking into his own living room. "This court," he began, "recognizes the need to balance justice with rehabilitation. The accused is a young man who made a mistake." Amara flinched. Carter clenched his jaw. Then from the rear of the courtroom, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. General Raven Whitmore entered, wearing civilian black, eyes calm, back straight. The room shifted, gasps, phones lifted. The judge blinked. "You're not recognized here," he spat. Agent Carter rose. "You'll want to recognize this." He walked to the prosecution table, laptop in hand, and clicked. From the speakers came a recording. Two voices. Chief Foster. "The general's kid is getting too close." Another voice, gravelly, cold. "Reassign him, forward position, Afghanistan, clean fix, no paper trail. Judge'll make sure the local kid walks." Judge Whitaker's face drained of color. Raven stepped forward, her voice ablade. "That was your voice, wasn't it, Judge? The voice that signed my son's death sentence, the voice that protected this boy," she pointed at Tanner, "while my son got sent to die." The room exploded. Reporters shouted, officers scrambled. The judge pounded his gavel. "This is inadmissible." "Not under federal whistleblower law," Carter said calmly. "This evidence was obtained by a DOJ informant. You're done, Judge." He turned to the bailiffs. "Take him into custody." And for the first time in his long reign over Texas courtrooms, Judge Howard Whitaker was led away in handcuffs. His robe flapped behind him like a flag surrendering to the truth. Tanner Grayson's mouth opened, but no words came. The structure built to protect him had just collapsed. His smirk faded, his posture deflated. He wasn't a weapon anymore. He was a casualty. As the courtroom descended into chaos, Raven stood still, her hands folded in front of her, the storm in her eyes finally calm. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The truth had cracked the marble. And now, the rot was spilling. The truth had finally pierced the walls, but truth, Raven would learn, was never free. It comes with scars, with casualties, and with a cost few are ever prepared to pay. The morning after Judge Whitaker was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, America woke up not to justice but to war on the airwaves. Raven's face was everywhere. Not the full raw footage of her being dragged at her son's funeral, or the recording that shattered a federal judge's career. No. Conservative outlets plastered images of her mid-arrest, taken from warped angles, frozen in time to make her look furious, dangerous, unhinged. Rogue general turns activist. Was the attack staged? Decorated or delusional? Whitmore's war on law enforcement. Funeral fiasco. Was it all a setup? The most toxic headline came from a network known for fanning flames. From commander to conspiracist, the downfall of Raven Whitmore. They brought on retired generals who never served with her. Career pundits with no combat history. They called her a divisive figure. Said she abused her rank for political vendettas. One man even suggested she orchestrated her son's death to gain attention. But Raven didn't flinch. She had long known what power does when it feels threatened. It rewrites the story. Let them smear her name. Because she wasn't here to be liked. She was here to be heard. And across the country, people were listening. What began as scattered protests turned into a national wave. Veterans in Louisiana, students in Baltimore, mothers in Detroit who'd buried sons under suspicious deployments, lawyers in California citing her case to reopen sealed indictments. The movement didn't have a single face, it had hundreds. But it had one name, the Xavier Monroe Justice Initiative. Launched by Amara and Officer Chen, the initiative became both a legal pipeline and a national beacon. It took in whistleblowers, funded lawsuits, and ran ads with one line. He didn't die in war. He was placed in it. More evidence surfaced daily. Anonymous tips, leaked memos, deployment logs that showed patterns even Pentagon oversight couldn't deny. Xavier's death had not been a tragedy. It had been a strategy. And now that strategy was unraveling. A week later, Raven received the summons. Congressional testimony. Closed door, then updated. Public session. Live-streamed. She arrived at Capitol Hill not in uniform, but in black. Her son's dog tags around her neck. The chamber was full before the hour struck. Veterans stood in the balconies. Reporters filled the wings. Political aides shifted nervously in their seats. She was introduced not as a general, but as a citizen witness. That was fine by her. Because today, she wasn't speaking as a soldier. She was speaking as a mother, as truth itself. She stepped to the microphone. Her prepared statement trembled slightly in her hands, but her voice didn't. My name is Raven Monroe Whitmore. I served 29 years in the U.S. military. I held men in my arms as they died for this country. I wrote letters to mothers I never met to tell them their children wouldn't be coming home. And then one day I became one of those mothers. The room fell silent. Captain Xavier Monroe was my son. He died on a mission that should have never happened. Not because of enemy fire, not because of bad intelligence, but because a network of men in robes and uniforms made sure he was placed in harm's way. Why? Because he was investigating them. A representative interrupted, cautious. General Whitmore, please refrain from speculation. She didn't stop. It's not speculation, it's evidence. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a recorder, the same one that had sealed Whitaker's fate. This is a call between Chief Malcolm Foster and Judge Whitaker, discussing my son's deployment as a clean fix. Their words, not mine. She pressed play. The room recoiled. The same voices. The same venom. Afghanistan, forward unit. He'll get the message there. Gasps. A few tears. But Raven wasn't done. This wasn't war. This was execution. And I'm standing here today not just for my son. I'm here for every name they tried to erase. Every medal that never made it home. Every mother who buried a folded flag and never knew why. The silence was no longer political. It was sacred. The hearing didn't end with a gavel. It ended with a standing ovation. And outside, on the Capitol steps, a crowd had gathered. Black, white, veteran, civilian, young and old. They weren't chanting slogans. They were chanting names, Xavier's and hers. What followed in the weeks after would be called the fall of the Brotherhood. Over 24 judges were placed under investigation. 7 were arrested outright. 12 officers, including Chief Foster, were indicted for conspiracy, falsifying reports, and unlawful deployment influence. 1 senator resigned. 2 resigned and ran. The term Brotherhood Doctrine entered legal textbooks as shorthand for weaponized bias within American institutions. Law students studied Raven's case the way they once studied Brown versus Board. And still, Raven didn't disappear. She didn't cash in. Didn't fade into advisory boards or high-paying defense contracts. She returned to Houston, and there, in the same family home where she first read Xavier's note, she opened a new door, the Monroe Center for Truth and Service. It was a think tank, a legal center, a place for survivors, soldiers who had questions, mothers who had doubts, investigators who had no other place to send the files they weren't allowed to file. Her office wasn't adorned with medals. It had one picture, Xavier, and under it, engraved on the desk, legacy was never meant to be quiet. In time, the media tried to rebrand her. Some called her the Mother General, others America's moral compass. She didn't answer to either, because she knew what power did with symbols. It weaponized them. But she also knew what truth did with suffering. It transformed it. She had become unwillingly a symbol, not just of pain, but of rebirth. And though the cost of truth had nearly broken her, it had also made sure Xavier's name would never again be spoken in silence. The sky over Houston carried a strange stillness, neither mourning nor celebration, just silence. Heavy, watchful, reverent. At the edge of the newly renamed Monroe Field of Honor, a place once etched in shadows and shame, rows of civilians and soldiers alike now stood shoulder to shoulder. No ranks, no separation. Just people, bearing witness. A stage had been erected in the center of the cemetery's ceremonial quadrant, where once the nation had watched its most decorated black general be dragged through the dirt. Now a sea of faces waited, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for remembrance. The field's old name had been removed weeks prior, along with the stained marble markers of men like Judge Whitaker and Chief Foster, symbols of a system that tried to cloak oppression in ceremony. Their legacy was gone, scrubbed from the official rolls. But the memory of what had happened here remained, and that was why General Raven Whitmore, once handcuffed beside her son's coffin, now walked the gravel path once again. But this time, not in chains. She wore no uniform, no medals, no rank, to shield her or define her, just black and Xavier's dog tags. The symbolic casket stood on a raised stone pedestal. It was polished but empty, a coffin that carried no body, only names. Beneath it, etched in steel, for those who were sent where they were never meant to return. At the podium, a local official stepped forward to open the ceremony. "Today," she began, "we don't just rename a field, we name the truth. We make it visible. Because the only thing more dangerous than a lie is a silence too many agree to keep. She stepped back, and Raven moved forward. No teleprompter, no notes, just breath, just memory. Her voice rang out across the field, quiet and full. I buried my son twice, once in war, and once under injustice. The silence that followed was a living thing, a wound that breathed. When they sent Xavier to Afghanistan, they didn't tell me it was punishment, they told me it was duty. But duty is supposed to protect, not execute. She paused. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not just for reaction, but to anchor herself. My son died looking for truth, so I decided to live carrying it. Then, from her jacket pocket, she withdrew a single folded flag. Not Xavier's real one. His had been trampled under police boots. This was newly folded, ironed, pristine, a replacement for what was taken. She stepped down from the stage and walked alone to the pedestal, placing the flag gently on the symbolic casket. There were no trumpets, no flyover, just the sound of breath. And history. No soldier, she said finally, turning to face them all, will ever again be buried alone. The words were not a promise. They were a warning, and the crowd responded, not with cheers, not with chants, but with something louder. Thunderous silence. Thousands of people standing tall, fists over hearts, no phones, no noise, just presence. And for once, Raven let the tears fall. They weren't grief. They were release. But just as she turned to leave, just as the closing music swelled and people began embracing one another, her phone vibrated quietly in her pocket. She ignored it at first. Then it buzzed again. And again. She stepped aside from the crowd into the shade of a stone wall. The message was simple. Unknown sender. One line. Not all ghosts are gone. Attached. A single still frame from a grainy security feed. It showed the edge of a courtroom, parking garage, a figure in shadows, too blurry to confirm. But the gate, the height, the outline. It looked like Xavier. Raven's hand froze mid-scroll, her throat clenched. She zoomed in. And there, barely visible through the noise of the image, a military-issued bracelet. His bracelet. And below the image, coordinates, a small island in the Indian Ocean. No name, just numbers. Raven looked back at the field, at the empty casket, at the folded flag, then back at the phone. And for the first time in months, something other than fire sparked in her chest. Hope. But hope was never safe, and ghosts never stayed buried long. To be continued.